Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 16. And today I'm joined by James World, who co-founded Azure Oxford user group with me. And pretty much every time I chat with James, I learn something new. He is a walking tech encyclopedia, and hopefully we'll get a few hints today on how he does this, because the topic of today is all about learning. So a massive welcome to the show, James.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here. And it's been fantastic seeing the podcast come on. So you had some really good episodes. I hope I can live up to the history.
Of that, I have no doubt. So before we start, could you give us a quick intro into your background and what it is you're up to nowadays?
Sure. I'm a solution architect. I've been doing that role now for probably the best part of a good 5 or 6 years. Before that, I've been contracting, working mostly for finance companies in the city. The most sort of, I guess, most interesting part of my career was at Microsoft. I spent 10 years there working with a wonderful team. It's the application development consulting team. And my role there was working for a large number of different clients across all sorts of fields, companies of all different sizes, and with, I think, probably some of the best people I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And, they really sort of honed my skills. It was quite a humbling place to work, being able to know that the guy sat next to you was probably just the best at something. I learned so much there, but I guess most importantly, I had the opportunity to see so many different clients with such a wide array of problems and challenges. I learned a phenomenal amount, and it's really sort of, I think, carried me through the rest of my career. But it was also a job where it was really understood that you need to pay attention to how technology is evolving. You need to learn. You need to have time to learn, to grow. And so we got given a lot of time in that role to train ourselves. And it's something that I've kept with me ever since. I think it's all too easy to stop paying attention to your skill set in the right way. And that's something that's always fascinated me, is just how do you keep up when the landscape is changing so quickly. I think the other thing that has been a real advantage for me is I got into computing at a really, really early age. So I think I was like 6 when my mum bought my dad a ZX Spectrum. And you can see you probably see behind me, the listeners can't, you can see I've got a ZX Spectrum on the shelf behind me. I fell in love with it then. It ended up in my bedroom after 3 weeks because my dad wanted his study bag, and I never left it alone since. But things have changed so much in the 40 years odd since I got that computer. If I'd ever sort of stopped learning along the way, then I'd be useless to the industry now.
Speaking of continuously learning, I saw on Twitter yesterday that you've now got a shiny new Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification.
I have, yes, yeah. I'm currently taking a short break in between jobs, starting a new job next week. I thought I'd put that time to good use. It's one of those things. I think a lot of us keep on sort of saying we need to go and get that certification. But yeah, I finally did it. It's actually not the first Microsoft certification I've done. Back when I was working at Microsoft, you could, as an employee, one of the nice benefits was on a Friday lunchtime, you could go down to Building 3 on the UK campus and sit at one of the Microsoft exams. So I picked up a few back then. But yeah, looking at my transcripts, I can see the last time I'd done a Microsoft certification was back in 2008. So yeah, been a while, but it was quite satisfying to do it. And I think it does, when you do these, I think it does make you question what's the value of a certification. And it's something that I think about a lot. I do a lot of interviewing in my job. And when I see credentials on CVs like that, I always had the same sort of thoughts running through my mind. Is this a case of somebody who has just studied to get that particular certification and doesn't really have the experience to back it up? Because to be honest, I think pretty much any sort of vendor certification like this, you can do that. There's so many study guides out there which are sort of kind of drilling you to pass that particular exam. And then you've got the person where they've got sort of broad and genuine experience in the topic, and the studying for them is kind of just more making sure that they've got a rounded view of the syllabus. And I think I think the exams have certainly improved a lot. They're much better now at testing that you do have the experience, but it's still something at the end of the day that you can drill to pass. So, somebody with my experience, I'm not really looking at these certifications as a way to prove that I know this material to a potential employer. I think, when you've got sort of 20 plus years of professional experience, your value to a potential employer is demonstrating the value that you brought to other employers that you've had. So I look at it more as a learning tool. For me, it forces you to fully explore the offering, the product, the tool, whatever it is that the certification is covering. And Azure is massive and growing all the time. So this certification, which covers a broad range of topics, is just a really useful way to see what's new, what's moved on from the stuff that you've been using for a long period of time. It's a great way of just checkpointing your knowledge and catching up.
I'm kind of just starting to go through this journey now at the very beginning. So I've kind of used Azure for a few years now, so know a reasonable amount. Obviously, definitely not as much as you, but I've actually not done any certifications. So I'm just planning on starting at the very beginning with the Azure fundamentals, just to get a feel for how the whole exams work. I don't know, then I'll probably do the developer one. I think that's the AZ204, I think. But yeah, so completely new to all this certification stuff.
Yeah, I notice as well that Microsoft have really been pushing the exams recently. I mean, obviously, from a vendor's perspective, it's a great marketing device, right? They want people to take those exams because they want to increase the knowledge of their offering in the market. And I don't have a problem with that, right? Yeah, everyone wins when you take that approach. It's always good to start at the beginning. The AZ900, I think it is, the fundamentals exam, is going to give you confidence that you can be successful at the exam, and it gives you some familiarity in how they work. They are predominantly, multi-choice questions. And I think when you hear multi-choice, you kind of think, oh, this is some sort of dumbed down exam. But really they're not. I think they do a good job. Now, I actually had a company I started a while back called the Test Factory, which offered technical tests for developers to use sort of during the interview process, that kind of thing. And so I know firsthand just how challenging it is to write a good question that tests knowledge. And it's actually the wrong answers that are the hardest ones to come up with. The idea of these questions is not to catch you out, right? It's there to test your understanding. And I think they do a pretty good job of that. Some of the questions in the exam seem really specific. And I think it's very easy to sort of say, well, if I needed to know the exact criteria that are required for Azure disk encryption to be able to work, then I just go look it up at the time that I needed it. And I think that's a fair reaction. But if you have genuinely worked with these tools, and if you have got that broad level of experience, then even though the questions seem sometimes very, very specific, they are actually genuinely sort of testing that you have an understanding of how the technology works. And they're not just sort of pick A, B, C, or D. They're kind of cunning. They'll have, pick the right value from this drop down, which has a whole host of options, or pick the 3 from these 7 things that are right. So there's enough combinations in there that you're not going to be able to sort of pass by being the gorilla randomly hitting the right answer.
Yeah, one thing I do like about the AZ900, the fundamentals one, is just the breadth of it, though. Because even though it's fundamentals, like there's some really obvious questions. Like I'm sure lots of people that use Azure know the difference between PaaS and IaaS and all this kind of stuff. But then it's also, as well as that, it goes into things like networking and just there's some really obvious stuff that anyone using the cloud will know, but there's stuff that I'm guessing that a lot of people that have used Azure for years, that if they don't do any studying at all, probably wouldn't get right, even on the fundamentals exam.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think sometimes the fundamentals are very easy to skip over. If you look at, I think AZ900, for example, spends some time looking at things like subscriptions and management groups and role-based access control and resource groups, those kind of organizing tools. I can't tell you how many times I've seen just an absolute chaos within a customer's Azure subscription, resource groups with 1,000 resources in them, mixed environments between, all sat alongside each other in the same subscriptions. Actually, it's, understanding those basic principles can really help you keep a clean and tidy house, which is so important as your real estate grows.
Taking your example of management groups, that's fairly new. So if you've been using Azure for years but you've not been keeping up, then you might not even know that exists.
Yeah, and they do keep changing the exams as well to reflect the progress. So it's something to be aware of. Is the solution architect qualification, I think, has a 2-year lifespan. That's how long it's valid for, and then you'll need to resit. So I definitely view it as a checkpoint that I will be revisiting regularly just to keep up to date with what's new and interesting.
Haven't they changed it recently where you don't have to resit the whole thing, but you can do like a refresher where it's a much smaller, I think every year or something?
I didn't know that. If they've done that, that certainly sounds good. It would be good to keep up with what's new. But to be honest, I don't think I would mind redoing the full thing. I mean, the exams are sort of 2.5, 3 hours, and that time flies by. And it does. I think it would force me to sort of go over the areas again that I don't use so often. And there were certainly sort of parts of the syllabus where I thought, I know that stuff. I don't need to spend too much time on it. But then digging into the syllabus a bit and uncovering it, I found a whole load of sort of changes and improvements that probably would have caught me out, but genuinely useful to know.
This just seems to be such a good gap analysis of your knowledge as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
With this learning thing, I kind of wonder what your thoughts are on like having schedules and goals as part of your learning, because I kind of need to book this exam just so I've got a goal and deadline to give me some focus.
You have hit on the number one top tip that I would give you. It's interesting, actually, since getting the certification, I've had a lot of comments along the lines of, I looked at getting this and that's as far as I've gotten. But to be honest, I think you need goals. It's so important to have a goal and to have a time scale. So my advice would be go to the Microsoft Learn website, which is a great resource. Look at the certification paths that are available. Decide, where you think is right for you. Take some time, but not too much. You don't need much more than maybe, half a day at most to browse through the syllabus and just make your best guess of how much time you think you're going to need to prepare. And then the next thing you should do is book the exam, because that is going to be an immovable feast in your diary. It will keep you working towards that goal. And it certainly helped me sort of prioritize and make sure that I'm doing the right amount of study to get through the syllabus.
Right, when we finish recording, I'm going to book my AZ900. You can hold me on that one. I don't know, maybe 2 weeks' time, I think that should be fine, because I think I know most of it, so I just want to go through and make sure. But yes, I'll get that booked.
Yeah, so that moves me on to something else. One of the things that certifications often comes up in conversation is looking at how you work to improve the people on your team, people that you're responsible for. If you're responsible for technical people, they want to grow and to develop. I think certifications can be a useful part of that roadmap. I often get sort of frustrated by the titles that exist in our profession. You see the phrase senior developer on a CV coming in, and honestly, you've got no idea of what that means from the title alone. You get places that will hand out the title senior developer because you've been there a certain amount of time, or in lieu of a pay rise. We are one of the sort of least structured professions when it comes to progressing people. And that's fascinating to me. And I have a model that I use, a way of thinking about what it means to be a developer. And I guess I break that down into 3 areas that are all overlapping to a certain extent. So the first of these is technical capability. And that's something obviously that we've been talking about a little bit. And I think it's the one that most obviously comes to mind when you think about growing as a developer. But it's also the area that is probably most easily addressable. And if you break that down a little bit further, then to grow technical capability, you need somebody that has curiosity, that has passion, that they're proactive about learning. They want to know how things work. You need somebody that is able to develop good attention to detail and rigor. They're going to submit high quality work. They're going to make sure that they've got good test coverage. You want somebody that wants to get their job finished. They don't procrastinate. They can compromise. They don't need to get the perfect solution. They know what's good enough to get it out of the door. And they've got a degree of courage. They're able to make significant changes when it makes sense to do so. It's so often that you see code bases where you've been afraid to delete things, been afraid to do major refactorings. We've got source control. If you deleted the wrong thing, it's so easy to put it back. But if you don't make the big changes, then that tech debt will just continue to mount up. So when you're measuring that, certification is a great way of giving objectives out. It's something that obviously the person taking the certification is going to feel good about, going to benefit from, and it's a very clear and visible goal that you can achieve. And I think sometimes companies worry about this, and there's that great quote, I can't remember who said it. It's a conversation, I think, between a CEO and a CTO. And I think the CEO is saying, well, what if we give everybody all these certifications and then they just leave? And the CTO turns around and says, well, what if we don't and they stay? I love that. Yeah, I'm a bit sort of nervous around sort of smart goals that are looking at sort of delivering completed stories to production, that kind of a thing, because that's kind of the core job. But anything that can demonstrate growth and understanding is valuable. I've plotted out roadmaps of training courses, for example, in Pluralsight in some places where I've worked. So, looking at the particular technical areas that developers have worked in and looking at what courses can help them round out their expertise and plotting it out that way.
So what would be when you're interviewing someone, some of the key indicators that you're looking for?
To answer that, I'm going to cover the other sort of two areas, because we've just spoken about technical capability. So the two other major facets that I'm looking for when I'm hiring is, secondly, a sense of connectedness. So connectedness is all about realizing that you're not the only person in the room. You have a team around you, and that you're not the only team in the world, and that there's a vast outside out there that you can learn from and share with. So a person that's got this sense of connectedness, they have a desire to contribute, a desire to learn from others. And here I'm looking for evidence of going to user groups, working on open source projects. If you're more senior, mentoring and teaching other people, perhaps delivering talks within your company, code pairing, and a sense of empathy with others. Very rarely, no matter how senior you are, you're going to have the best solution to a problem. With great connectedness, you can get to the best ideas by listening to what everybody in the team has to offer and picking the best of them and forming a solution which makes everybody feel that they've been included in the conversation. Even if the decision that gets made wasn't your idea, but you feel that you've been listened to, then you're going to feel good about the decision that's been made.
There is a really brilliant book that I listened to. It's on Audible. I listened to this. It was quite a few years ago, which basically describes exactly what you're saying. I don't know whether you've read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
I have, yes. An excellent book. Really, really good. Recommend that one. Yeah.
I think I'll have to re-listen to it again.
Yeah, and I think one of the key messages about that book is about really having that empathy, about listening to people and not being the only voice in the room. In terms of the kind of goals that you can give people around developing their connectedness, then you can look at evidence of attendance at meetups, technical presentations. I think that can be quite daunting for some people. So there are lots of ways to gradually give people a voice. Some of them are incredibly nervous about the sound of their own voice. So you can start small, encouraging people to share ideas in stand-ups, or just asking them questions, building up to giving short demonstrations to work that they've done in show and tells, to longer talks within their own teams, lightning talks at user groups. I think there's a path there to getting a voice, but also just going to the meetings and being a listener. Again, just engaging with the community. If you use a particular technology, there's almost certainly going to be a user group for that technology. So, go and learn what you can do, what you can bring back to the team.
Yeah, I've quite often found that when I've worked in teams, just because I quite often do talks, because I do also do them internally as part of the team, then I find that other team members start to want to do internal talks as well. And then as more people do it, it starts to spread throughout the team. And it's really satisfying seeing that happen.
Yeah, it's absolutely agree. I think other good things that play into the connectedness goal is just resolving problematic pull requests in groups, spending time code pairing, even evidence of producing great technical documentation. That's another way of sharing information across teams. It's really good.
I really like with the whole pair programming. Not the current project I'm working on. The past team I was working with, we pretty much did pair programming all day, and that taught me so much about pair programming. Because I know a lot of people might think, oh, well, that's double the resources, so we can't do that. But actually, I'm sure you've heard the term rubber duck debugging.
Yeah.
For the listeners, it's if you've got a problem and you're explaining it to someone, and the act of explaining it, talking it out loud, you solve the problem yourself. And I found with pair programming, it's rubber duck development all the time because you're both talking things out.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the whole connectedness thing has obviously been taken to a whole new level during the pandemic. I remember as the pandemic was taking sort of growing speed and we were going into a proper lockdown. At the time, I changed teams within the company where I was working, and the first stand up that I went into in the new team, nobody had their cameras on, and I'd just come from a team where we had that sort of really good sense of community and camaraderie, and there was just no energy in this stand up. And so the first thing I said was, right, get your makeup on, get dressed, and turn your cameras on.
Did you go and put your makeup on then, James?
Of course, yeah. But instantly, the energy lift in the Zoom room was palpable. It makes such a striking difference. That I can't remember. There's some percentage that gets banded around. It might be 80% of communication is visual rather than the actual words that you say, and it's so true. It's so important to be able to see how people are reacting to what you're saying. It's magic. I mean, just even try it as an exercise. Just try and run a remote meeting without the cameras on, and then turn them on. It just is. It's like a magic spell. And the other part is as well. I think during the pandemic, it's so important to not just go straight into business. I've run a daily stand up throughout most of the pandemic, and the first thing I always do coming in is just bring up something that's not related to work. Talk about what the weather is like. Talk about something that's been happening on the news. Ask people what they did over the weekend. We're all people and we all have lives, and I think you need to respect that, and it just brings people out themselves and gets a conversation going. Then of course you have to make sure that you don't do that for too long. I try and keep it to 5 minutes, but it makes a big difference in the daily stand up.
Well, I think especially now things are virtual. When you go to physical offices, there's all the kitchen. When you're getting a coffee, there's lots of conversations that go there. And unless you introduce some kind of like conversational aspect to stand-ups and that kind of thing, then you've got to think about people's mental health as well. Not everyone's comfortable being isolated at home with no just chat and non-work conversation.
Yeah, so it's so important to do the rounds, and I guess I'd be spending at least as much time as I have been doing in the office, just giving people a call off spec, say, how's it going? How are you getting on with the problem that you're working on? Just letting people know that you're there and you're available to talk to, and that they're okay. I think you have to balance it though. We did end up introducing a rule in one of my teams where meetings should have at least 24 hours notice wherever possible, so that you could sort of plan your day a bit and not get interrupted when you were working on something. So there is a balance, but yeah, you do have to find the right balance, and especially for those people that aren't so comfortable with reaching out, being proactive about it can be really important. So the third aspect or circle of a developer is leadership. This is very much a mindset. A person with good leadership skills is going to know how to develop, how to follow a sense of purpose, and that they're willing to point out and own and fix things that are broken. Not just about the work getting done, but about culture, about people's career tracks. They take responsibility. They have an owner's mindset, and they know that they are going to be personally on the line for delivering working solutions. Obviously, communication and persuasion is important, being able to effectively communicate and argue ideas to ensure that the team are informed of relevant facts and that they understand and contribute to business strategy and ensure that development is aligned to it and they're able to make decisions based on business value, and that they know the next right thing to do. So they can take any strategy and break it down into smaller deliverable sequential steps. I think that one can be harder to give to people, but again, small steps of increasing the level of responsibility. If you have a complex solution, maybe giving somebody ownership of a particular area or a responsibility for a particular technology that you're using, and then you can gradually sort of raise the level of responsibility that you're giving people. Yeah, so they're the sort of the three areas that I look to. So I think you're asking, when it comes to interview, what am I looking for? I think it's important, before getting on to what I'm looking for, I think it's important to say that you need to be really clear what it is as a team that you're looking for from a role, and to think about why somebody would want to come in and perform that role. It's amazing how often it's skipped as a step. A sort of request will come in. We need to get 3 more developers. Well, why do we need to get 3 more developers? What exactly is it they're going to do, and why would they enjoy doing it? Why would they want to do that? So the most important thing I do at the start of an interview is to sell the job. And it is astonishing to me how often people don't do that. They'll go straight into, I've been looking at your CV and I'd like to talk about this, and this. The first responsibility you have as an interviewer is to convince people that you have something that they're going to enjoy and find worth doing. And the answer to that question may be that they're not going to enjoy it and they don't want to do it. And you're going to waste a whole load of time if you don't establish that it's something that they're going to be interested in. And going back to what I said, what does a senior developer mean? It might mean something completely different to the person that's interviewing for the role. So if that's all that you've given them coming in, you have a duty to explain what's your company about, what's the team about, what is it that you're trying to do, why is that going to help them grow in their career prospects. So I always spend the first 15 minutes of any interview doing that, even if it's not the first interview that they've had, because maybe they've had the first interview with a hiring manager. The hiring manager is going to have had a different perspective. The person is going to have had some opportunity to think about what's been said. So just checking that we're still all on the same page and it's still something that sounds good.
I guess from the interviewee's point of view, it's very important to remember that, as you just alluded to, it's a two-way interview, and ask questions. Don't be afraid. The questions aren't a one-way thing.
Yeah, and that's something else I'll say in that first part is I'll ask them if they've got any questions, but I'll also say, maybe you haven't had a chance to formulate the questions that you want to ask. You just had a whole bunch of new information. So, keep that in the back of your mind, and I'm going to make sure at the end of this interview that we're going to give some time for you to ask anything that might have occurred to you during the interview. So then obviously, inevitably, we do need to start talking about the candidate themselves. And I think I have a few things to say here. From a technical knowledge point of view, I'm not necessarily going to be looking for somebody that has precisely the technical skills that we need for whatever the job is. I think it's you'd be very lucky to find somebody that has a perfect fit technically with what you're looking for, even if you're using the same technology. A lot of technologies can be used in vastly different ways. You think about the surface area of something like even Kubernetes, for example. There's a lot of common principles, but you can leverage that tool in so many different ways. I'm most interested in what somebody has claimed to have experience and expertise in, because I can use that as kind of a yardstick. So if somebody describes themselves as an expert in C#, but is unable to tell me what's happening in the C# landscape, what the new features are that's coming up, or is able to talk effectively about what's in the language, then that's immediately going to fire some warning bells to me. If they're not really an expert at C#, then what else are they sort of claiming expertise in that perhaps they're coming up short in? So my watch is be careful what you put on your CV. If you're going to claim that you know something, make sure that you know it. the surface area is just so big. It's just unreasonable to expect people to know what you know, right? You shouldn't be measuring somebody else against your own knowledge and expertise. You should be thinking about what's absolutely necessary for the job, what can be taught. There's vast amounts of training resources out there that can enable somebody who, if somebody has demonstrated that they can get expertise in one programming language, then they can probably be taught to an equal level of expertise in another programming language, and the same for any sort of given technology. So, really, I'm looking for how good are they at what they say they're good at.
That definitely makes sense. I can picture a lot of interviewers who are maybe developers themselves, almost seeing it as like a, what's the right word? I'll put them
pissing contest.
Yes. Maybe not quite those words, but that's what I was alluding to. But
yeah, no, I don't. I certainly don't look for that at all. And I think this is a good point to say that I always lead with sort of what I'd sort of say softer, open questions to give people an opportunity to tell me about themselves in their own way. And I split that up into 5 different categories, actually. So the first category, relevant to what we've just been saying, is culture add. And I love this expression. We often talk about making sure that somebody is a good cultural fit. And I think that's dangerous because so often we tend to make the mistake of hiring in our own image. You think that what's good is somebody that is like you, and it's quite an arrogant attitude to have, I think. I like the phrase cultural add because instead of looking for somebody that fits into your team, you're looking for somebody that can complement the skills that you already have within your team, that can bring something new to the team, bring a new perspective. So I look at exploring what's somebody done that's unique to them. How can I benefit from working with this person as opposed to one of their teammates? I ask them, tell me about when understanding how somebody else has solved a problem or somebody else's perspective has helped you accomplish something within a role. And then in answering that question, people will often then talk about particular technical solutions that they've employed in a problem. And then you have the opportunity to go and ask about technology as well. But you're inviting them into an area where they feel comfortable talking about something. So the second area is innovation. So this is all about exploring people's creativity, their ability to come up with new ideas and new ways of doing things. It's an opportunity to look at what they know about emerging technologies within the landscape, what new ways that they can deploy sort of new technology to solve old problems. The third one is the ability to base their decisions on evidence. So, a good example of this is if you're going to make sure that you need to hit a particular SLA or a particular performance goal, do you actually gather the evidence? Can you analyze logs? Can you look at execution plans in a database and figure out the right things to focus on optimizing? If you're looking at a new feature for a product, how do you know that that's the right feature to be looking at? Are you able to collect data on how features in your application are used and use those to make informed decisions about the next feature or the right way to enhance that feature? Can you use data to tell if the work that you have done has been valuable? If you put a new feature out there, did you put the right metrics in to understand that people are using that feature in the way that you expected and that it's brought the benefits that you were hoping for?
I guess that kind of matches onto the whole, in the olden days where you used to build a product and throw it over the wall to ops and then forget about it, where more modern teams, people are taking ownership when it's in production, then just adding metrics and telemetry. It's kind of a developer's now more aware of the consequences if they don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that is often overlooked. And I think that as an issue, it often starts really early in the process, often quite sort of high up and with the business, where you fall into that trap, maybe as a manager or as maybe a salesperson, of asking your development team for a feature that your customer has asked for you that you've heard about. And what you're effectively then doing is pushing down a solution rather than a problem to your creative team. And it's once you've sort of got it wrong at that level, you have this kind of snowball effect. What I really like to see are really clear business objectives expressed as problems. So, for example, a good objective might be, I want to reduce the amount of time it takes new customers to onboard to our product by 50%. Right, immediately, that's going to open you up to all sorts of creativity, technical creativity to solve that problem. And you have a clear measurement there. Right? I want to reduce the amount of time it takes customers to onboard. So now developers can start thinking about, well, what can we measure? When does onboarding start? When does it finish? What metrics can I put into the features that help reduce onboarding time? So, for example, I saw a tweet the other day about Code Tours. It's a free extension in Visual Studio Code that helps you walk through a code base. Now that could be used to reduce the onboarding time of developers coming into a technical team. Yeah, so that's a really novel way of approaching, the developer onboarding problem. But if you had instead been given a feature to create a virtual machine image that was pre-installed with all the developer tools, or write some specific instructions, some onboarding documentation, then you missed an opportunity there to get a more creative solution to that problem. But I guess the key thing, going back to the start of this, sort of being data-driven, is that with the metrics in place, then you have the ability to test a whole variety of different solutions to that problem and pick the one that's most effective. And so it's so important to not be blindly implementing features from the backlog, but to be able to understand, are these solutions effectively solving the core problem that they were designed to address?
I guess a lot of developers would think about metrics and thinking about measuring performance or things very technical and not think about business metrics.
Yeah, and you have to remember the reason why you are being hired is to make money for the company. If you are costing the company more than they are making from you, then you are, by definition, useless to them. In fact, you're worse than useless. You're a liability. And especially for senior people, it's so important that people understand that they are there for that reason. And I think it's particularly challenging when you're being given just a laundry list of features. It makes it so intangible. But if you're being given problems that have been coming from the business and you clearly understand the rationale for addressing those problems and what success looks like, it's so much easier to turn around and prove to the business that you are worth that pay rise, for example. So the next area that I look at is collaboration. And this goes back to that connectedness circle that we were talking about before. And that is, can you participate as part of a team? And this can be, you can explore this by asking, tell me about when you were working closely with colleagues to achieve a particular goal. What was your role in that team? What did you achieve? Or asking somebody about when they had a disagreement with somebody on the team. What was the disagreement about and how was it resolved? And it's amazing how many people will freely tell me about a major argument and a falling out that they had with somebody. Obviously what you're really looking for here is empathy, understanding that there are different views. And it goes back to the point I was making about being able to consider all of the options and making a choice about the right way to go that makes everybody feel that they've been listened to, but you don't end up stuck in analysis paralysis.
With the whole argument thing, interviewees that are saying why they left the previous job and then they start slagging them off. It's like, okay, that's not really selling you as an individual. So I guess that's another thing to be careful about as an interviewee.
Yeah, I think arguing in the proper sense of the word, so not having a slanging match, but being able to put forward a proposition and examine it and find the best solution. That's so important, and it's increasingly becoming a lost art. Unfortunately, the modern world seems to be a place of increasingly polarized opinions, and we have to be really careful to be responsible about that. It applies absolutely in development, and trying to leverage everybody's experience to get the best solution. It's not about picking your solution or my solution. It's about coming up with something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So the final area is about grit, about determination. So this is where the classic question will come up. Tell me about your biggest professional failure. What did you learn from it? I'm looking for somebody to be able to admit when they're wrong or when they don't know something, and that they can then learn from that. How did you compensate for the problem that you came up with? And everybody has their story here. Everybody has their story. I can tell you about the time that I accidentally dropped a table in a production database and had to spend some frantic hours rebuilding the data, fortunately from transaction logs that were available to do so. But what did I learn from that? I learned about the importance of not running code that you've just written in a window against a production database, but making sure you're testing it properly in a staging environment first.
And I bet you never did it again.
I never did it again. Touch wood, I won't do it again in the future. It's also about, asking people about any goals that they're working towards and how they're going. That's where you can see the positive aspects of things like certifications. If somebody has been proactive about improving their skills, asking them to demonstrate that can be a good way of drawing that out. So all of those questions, all those areas that we've been talking about, the key thing for me in an interview there is you're giving people an opportunity to tell you their story, and then you can take it to the fine details, the technical details, to draw out their technical skills.
So I've actually seen quite a few of your talks now at .NET Oxford, Azure Oxford, I think the DDD conferences as well. And I think my favourite one has definitely been your talk on books and reading. I think it was so super motivational. And I do try to read every day, but it's nowhere near as much as I would like. And every time we speak, you seem to have read yet another 10 books or so. How do you do it?
Okay, well, I can definitely address that. I think I'll build up to it, though. I think it's worth pointing out that I am definitely passionate about books. I think they're great, but they're not the only way to learn. So it's worth sort of reviewing, I think, the main ways that we do learn today. Obviously, many of us were lucky enough to go to university and to do some sort of relevant, vocational course like a computer science degree and so on. It's always amazing to me how often people have come from other walks and completely unrelated backgrounds academically. We're such an open profession now. I think it's growing so much. There's so much opportunity, and often the barriers to entry are actually pretty low. I think it was Uncle Bob say that the profession is doubling the number of developers, so every 5 years or so, which means that at any one time, half the developers out there have got less than 5 years experience. But technology, again, is moving on all the time, and academic research is moving on all the time. So I do pay attention to what's happening in academic circles and try and spend some time looking at academic papers, which I think is something that people do often ignore and leave out. So, computer science doesn't stop when you leave university. And if you never went, then it's worth looking at some of the more academic texts that are out there. So, don't forget academia. It can be really relevant and very interesting. A lot of people that I listen to an interview say they read blogs, and I always sort of cringe slightly when I hear that. How do you learn? I read blogs. Blogs are such a mixed bag. There are some amazing blog authors out there, to be sure, but there's also a lot of what I call marketing blogs that are clearly just aimed at personal brand management. They can be, somebody's notes on a topic. It's not really a good sort of structured way to develop your learning. You can hit on a blog that absolutely solves just the problem that you were trying to solve yourself, or that just gives you the right level of intro on a particular technology, but they can't be the entirety of your study. So then we can sort of turn to more structured tools like Pluralsight, Udemy, video-based training, which I use extensively, and I think that's a great way to learn. Attending user groups and going to conferences. I think especially now with virtual conferences, it's great that so many of them are videoed and you have access to go back and watch those. Podcasts are a fantastic way of learning, of course. And I tend to, much like blogs, actually, I tend to look at podcasts as a great way to keep me abreast of what's happening more generally in industry. I don't think you're going to gain deep technical insight from a podcast, but it is going to give you a bunch of ideas about sort of bullet points for further study. And then obviously, just talking with people, talking to the guys in your team. And seeing what they found out about can give you things to go and look at. But all of these things, especially the sort of more technical solutions, as advanced as they are, they don't have the wonderful technical ability that books have always had. See, books come with this feature.
I know what's coming.
Books come with this feature that no other technology has been able to crack. It's called the automatic pause. That books are smart. They know when you're not paying attention, and they immediately and automatically pause. And I can't tell you how many times I'm watching a conference video or listening to a user group talk when the speaker says something and it just sets my mind off on a tangent. And 5-10 minutes can pass and I've missed half the talk because I've gone off on this sort of mental diversion. And even if you're listening to recorded material, then constantly having to rewind and go back and re-listen to things is a pain. But with books, you don't get that. With books, they'll stay exactly where they were and you can come up and sort of get back into it. So I love that feature. The other aspect of books is that they're quite often a work of passion. Right? Somebody has got some idea that they want to get off their chest, or they just really love a particular technology and feel that they have something to say about it. It's a lot of work to write a book. People rarely write technical books, for the money. I think, books can obviously be rewarding. They can go stellar and be something that every developer has on their bookshelves. But they're, I think, much more often a work of passion. And so you'll get an awful lot more care and attention to detail in a book than you'll often find in other forms of media. And they usually come with, a technical editor and peer reviews. All of these things serve to elevate the quality. Oftentimes they're written by multiple authors. So, that sort of brings me on to how you should go about reading technical books and how you can read a lot of technical books and do it quite quickly. So when I pick up a book, or when I hear about a book, the first thing I'll do is walk through this little process. Very simple. I'll look at the title and I'll decide, is it interesting? And then I'll flip it over and look at the back of the book, read the blurb, the description there, ask the question again, is this still interesting? Then look at the table of contents, asking the same question. Then I'll look, if it's the kind of book that lends itself to this, not all do, but often you'll be able to read the first and last chapter of every paragraph where they give you the intro and the summary and find out if there's something in there that's still interesting that you want to know more about. I think it's important to remember that books aren't written in order. Most of the time, there'll be one message that is the most important message that an author wants to get across. And that's often where they'll start. And you can have a great message buried in a book that's otherwise, frankly, quite a lot of padding. So by going through the books this way, you can really quickly zero in on the part that is going to be most valuable to you. And it's, again, especially when books have more than one author as well, you see this even more. They're just not written in order. And so you need to get away from the idea that you have to start at the beginning and follow every page in order. As developers, we have this very sort of rule-based mindset, and it can be a really tough habit to break. That you almost feel dirty when you start doing this. That you're jumping into a book and not reading a significant chunk of it. But you'll get the essence of the book really quickly, and you'll be able to make the right exit decision on a book that isn't right for you much more quickly. And there are great tools out there to help you do this as well. Right? So I have an O'Reilly subscription, for example. They used to be called Safari Books Online. You pay an annual fee. You get access to a vast library of technical books from all sorts of publishers, not just O'Reilly. And they also have video-based training and live webinars and all sorts. But the feature I love most is that I can put a particular topic in and I'll get results which give me not just books and webinars and so on that will talk about that particular topic, but even the individual chapters in books that will cover a particular topic. And you can learn so much more by reading 4 or 5 different authors' take on the same topic than reading, one opinionated viewpoint that may leave out sort of key areas of the topic. You get a much more rounded view. Other tools that can help. I'm a huge fan of Manning. I love the fact that they make all of their books available early, the early access program, and that you can download them as PDFs. I use a tool called Goodreader on my iPad, which has a great feature which enables you to bring up a tree of the structure of the book. And that can be really good for helping you walk through a book quickly in the way that I described previously. And the early access feature on Manning, that gives you an opportunity to influence the book. Right? There's an active forum where you can engage with other readers of the book. You can see the challenges that they've been having. And yeah, you're saying you can actually influence the way that particular chapters are written, and can often get a lot more out of the book that way. Yeah, so use technology to your advantage. I now have my entire library of, I haven't counted, but it must be hundreds, if not thousands of books, all sat on my iPad, either literally in there as PDFs or available through an online subscription. But I guess the key question is, with all of those books out there, what books should you read? And the way that I tend to approach this is I think about books in 4 different categories. So the first category I call Know Your Tools. So this is about sort of don't fail at the basics. As a developer or as a UX guy, whatever it is that you happen to be into, you're going to be using a core set of tools every day. Perhaps it's C#, for example, you're a C# developer, or insert the language of your choice here. So do you know your language? Do you know what Visual Studio Code can do? Do you know what Visual Studio can do? Do you know how the compiler works? These are the things that you use day in, day out, every day. And they change all the time. So keeping up to date on the specific tools that you're using is so important. If you're a C# developer, things like, if you've not read John Skeet's book on C# in depth, then what's wrong? You absolutely should know that book. Even books that sort of go into the CLR in a bit more detail. Jeff Richter's book, CLR via C#. It's a joy to read, and it will tell you fundamentally how the .NET framework operates. And even though the last edition of that is now going back quite a few years, it's still just as relevant for modern .NET Core as it was for the .NET framework. So yeah, for me, that's kind of table stakes. You need to know that. You need to know that stuff, and you need to keep up to speed with it. So the next category I bring up is Know Your Theory. Having said that the tools, the everyday stuff that you use is really important, there is an element to which that's going to have sort of an expiry date on it, right? Because technology changes all the time. And I think we so often overemphasize knowing the latest framework, Angular, React, Vue, for example, on the front end, that we forget to really focus on what's underneath, what holds all of these things together. So this area is Know Your Theory. And, I think I'm really fortunate because I entered the profession at a time where, I had my Spectrum. This is a simple device. You could pretty much learn every aspect of how that thing worked. I really feel for people entering the profession today. When you look at a modern PC, you couldn't hope to understand every aspect of how that thing works today. They're so big and they're so complicated now. So I feel really blessed that I came into it at a time when I could do that. So for people that haven't had that opportunity, there's a book I would recommend, The Elements of Computing Systems. And every book I mentioned, by the way, I'm going to give Dan a link to a list of all the books, so you can look at these afterwards. But this is a great book because it takes a very, very simple model of a computer, and throughout the book, starting from simple logic gates, from NAND chips, and nothing else, you build through simulated software, and then eventually actual software. You build all of the chips, the CPU, the ALU. You build up, sort of memory, the bus, up to building an operating system, a compiler, and a programming language, and writing a game at the end of it all. That is just, you feel that you built every single aspect of that machine. And it's a very simplified, ideal machine. But yet those principles apply against modern sort of Windows and Linux-based operating systems. And they're going to help you make sense of that exception or that crash and be able to get under the covers of the language that you're using. Other aspects of theory, things like unit testing, how to refactor code, principles like dependency injection, for example, the dependency inversion principle or the single responsibility principle and so on. How to produce clean code, how to produce threat models for attack surface areas of your code, design patterns that you can use. All of these things will transcend any particular set of tools that you happen to be using today. Right? If you have a good approach to unit testing, you can take that and apply it to any framework or language that you happen to be using. A good example of this, for example, in the testing space, something called approval testing. It doesn't come up that often in articles and podcasts. So this is a great tool. You can read about it. I think the URL is approvaltests.com, but it's a testing approach that I've used multiple times during my career. The idea is this, is that you have some test output that by most means would take an enormous amount of work to produce a set of passing tests. So something like maybe an HTML-based report or a PDF output. So approval testing takes the approach of we are going to create some output, and then we're going to look at that and decide if it's what we were expecting. So we use our human eyes to go and look at this output and decide if we approve of that result. And if you do approve of that result, then that becomes the standard for all future executions of the test.
So is this the same as snapshot testing?
Yes, basically it's very similar. Yeah, I think it's another word for the same concept. So you take your approved version, and then every subsequent run of the test is going to take the output that the test generates and then do a comparison to make sure it's the same as the previously approved version. The really nice thing about the approval testing libraries, and it's been sort of extended to quite a large number of languages now, is that it will make use of the typical diffing tools. So things like Beyond Compare, Tortoise Diff, the Visual Studio baked-in diff, for example. And if there is no match, it will fire up that tool as long as you're running interactively and highlight the thing that's changed. So I find that you can, in extreme cases, you can substitute what would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of test cases with one all-encompassing test that yet still leads you directly to the problem should you have introduced a bug. Now, it's not a panacea, obviously. It's one thing to have in your toolbox, and you will find there will be times when it's absolutely ideal for the matter at hand. The principle I've applied to domains that have been using lots of different programming languages. So that's the kind of thing that I mean by theory, things that are reusable from across a wide range of technical domains.
Do you find that fits more with front-end testing, or where do you find that fits? Because it's quite interesting, all these different types. You've obviously got unit tests, integration tests. There's and I'm doing an episode next month about this, is mutation testing. And there's all these different types of testing and so many different scenarios and places where each of these types of testing work much better than other places.
Yeah, and so you kind of need to have an appreciation of the full suite of options available to you. There's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. To your original question, I think it does have broader applications beyond just the front end. So just reaching through my mind for a couple of examples, I actually used it one time when I created a DSL. I was working for a place that did timesheet billing and had some really, really complicated timesheet rules. You wouldn't believe how complex it can get to work out somebody's pay. But we created a DSL to describe that, and it had so writing a compiler, we had a fairly complex abstract syntax tree. We were able to spit it out in JSON to produce the output for an approval test. We had very little time to achieve this. And I think you could have gone down that road of testing every single possible combination of cases, but writing some exemplar programs in this DSL, we're able to produce a small number of outputs of the AST and really quickly verify that they were right. And the diff comparison to highlight lines of a JSON tree where there were problems was an absolutely perfect way for us to spot problems. I think we had, maybe 5 tests, and if I'd gone down a sort of more typical unit testing approach, it would definitely have been hundreds of tests required.
Yeah, interesting with the last episode where we had Jason Bock talking about C#9 source generators. that feels like a perfect case where you're actually generating code. Does the generated code match the expected snapshot?
Yeah, absolutely. But it is a technique that is often very useful in the front end, especially where you're using it to test, say, the output for a web page. Because the challenge you have there is that a change in a component that's used in a lot of places can end up breaking large numbers of tests. But if you've got a small number of approval tests, snapshot tests can be very quick to run through and go, oh yeah, that's a difference that I was expecting. So the next of the four categories, I think we're on number 3 now. One of my favorite ones, actually, because again, this is one that is so often overlooked by technical people, and that is know your business. And there's 2 aspects to this as well. So whatever company you're working for, it's going to be operating in some particular business domain. I've recently been working for a maritime company, for example. So the shipping is an absolutely fascinating domain. And it was so useful and so important for me going in as an architect to understand, how does chartering work? How do you manage a shipping company? So I read a lot of books around that topic, from sort of technical books that talk specifically about how the maritime industry operates, to actually a book I just recommend to anybody because it's just a fascinating book. It's a book called Deep Sea and Foreign Going, which written by Rose George. It follows her trip on a container ship across the world. Absolutely fascinating insight into, I think, something that very rarely has a torch shined onto it. So that's the first aspect: is do you know the business of your business? How does it work? And that can be, if you're doing any kind of, for example, domain-driven design, clearly it's invaluable to be able to speak the language of your business and your customers and really know it well. The other aspect is that part of business that applies whatever the business that you're in. Are you able to speak the language of the board? Do you know how to read a company balance sheet? Do you know the basics of accounting? Do you know why your company's share price is so closely tied to EBITDA, for example? Right? These are kind of like table stakes for having a meaningful conversation with the business. If you think that a particular technology choice is going to have a beneficial aspect to the business, you need to know how to be able to sell that appropriately. So you need to be able to talk in terms that the business is going to understand. The other aspect of this comes into sort of knowing the right kind of metrics that you need to pay attention to when you're running a team, a DevOps process, for example. Do you understand the value stream within your business? Do you know key metrics like lead time and cycle time and failure rate and mean time to repair, and why they are important to a business? Having that lingo, it's just going to make you so much more valuable and approachable and meaningful to the organization where you're working. So yeah, know your business.
I would love to see your OneNote 6 months after you've worked for a company.
It's, especially, the first 90 days within a business where you don't, you come in, all you've really been able to glean is what you've been able to do sort of research from the company's website, and you really don't know anything about them. Those first 90 days, it's so important to absolutely immerse yourself in what makes that business tick, and how they make their money and what they're doing it for. So the final category, I think possibly the most fun one, is I call it know something different. So this is all about expanding your horizons, stepping outside of your comfort zone. So that could be as simple as learning a programming language that is as far removed and as different from the one that you're currently working with. For a C# developer, an example I often come up with is Haskell. I can tell you that learning Haskell probably did more to improve my C# than any C# book I had ever read. It gives you a different perspective, and I think people are often so precious about the language that they have chosen to focus on. I mean, how many Twitter storms have basically been, a bunch of C# guys saying C# is the best, it's awesome, Java sucks, and the Java guys doing the exact reverse. And so often you advocate for what you know. this is it's a really important to step outside your comfort zone and to understand what else is out there and why other programming languages exist. I couldn't pick up a Haskell compiler and write a Haskell program off the top of my head now. That's not what it's about. Right? I think if you're not using something day in, day out every day, then you're going to get rusty. But it's just about getting your neurons to fire in a different way and understand different approaches to the ones that you're comfortable with.
I guess just experiencing different paradigms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, C# has grown so much as a language by embracing some of the ideas in other paradigms, particularly obviously recently in functional programming. But it's not and is never going to be a way of taking a pure approach to functional programming. There is a reason why F#, Haskell, other functional programming languages exist, and C# is never going to replace them. If you look at Go, for example, Go has taken the approach of trying to take a very stripped down, simplistic approach and be a very sort of bare bones language that has just enough functionality. That solves the problem that I think is increasingly going to be a challenge in C#, where you have any number of ways of solving the same problem. So you start to get into real challenges of getting consistency in your code base. If all of your developers have to understand every possible way of solving the same problem, that's going to add cognitive load, which is going to slow you down when it comes to maintaining code. So now you have to spend time in C# code bases making sure that you have a consistent approach. If you choose a simpler programming language where there's only one way of solving a particular problem that makes sense, then you're going to end up with a much more maintainable code base. But that's not going to be right for every situation. I notice, for example, that Go is now introducing generics into the language, and I wonder if that's the sort of the thin end of the wedge. It'll be interesting to see how effective they are at maintaining that simplicity.
Yeah, I keep on seeing on Twitter people that I know that are C# developers like slowly getting into Go, and I need to have a play because I've looked at the syntax, but I've not properly looked deeply into it. But
yeah, and equally, I've heard of people that have gone into it, got very excited about it, and then ended up getting sort of frustrated when they end up having to do a lot of repetitive coding because they aren't able to create the nuanced abstractions that you can create in a more capable, feature-rich language like C++ or Scala or C# or something like that. Another good language that's completely different, the Erlang, or sort of slightly more modern incarnation, Elixir, which is a language that is very much based on the actor programming model. I took time out to spend a lot of time playing with Erlang, and that really helped solidify my understanding of frameworks like Akka or Orleans, which embrace the actor programming model. But it doesn't have to be programming languages, right? If, for example, you are frustrated by the way that your team currently approaches agile development, then maybe looking into agile techniques that are out there, maybe really understanding how to do Scrum or Kanban well, understanding more about tools like planning poker or user story mapping, or getting into user experience design. Just do something different, open your mind a little bit. So that's the last of my 4 categories. So hopefully that sort of gives you some ideas and some inspiration of different ways to enrich your learning. But as I said, there's so many ideas out there. I've developed a sort of a curated list of books that have been interesting to me over the years, and I'll make sure that Dan, you have that for the show notes.
Yeah, touching on that last point you just mentioned about like different paradigms, even if you don't go to the extent of something like Elixir, that kind of thing, just where most developers now are full stack, if you are solely a back-end developer or solely a front-end developer, having a play around with the other side, or like do front-end, back-end database, try some mobile, desktop, web, even within the the more popular ways of doing development, you've still got so many different streams you can take and learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. I just recently been playing with Svelte. It's been around for quite a while now, but that's a fascinating sort of new direction for front-end frameworks where the heavy lifting is all done at the compilation stage, which means that it has performance metrics that are just blow the likes of React and Angular away, because they've sort of compiled everything down to simple code.
I remember a few years ago you did the talk. Is it Elk? Or what was the front end?
Yeah, Elm.
Elm, that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounded like, was it like zero bugs functional front end programming?
Yeah, fascinating. Again, this is Elm is a kind of like the Go approach to functional programming. It's an extremely stripped down functional programming language which embraces the model view update pattern. And its selling point is that you have zero exceptions from your JavaScript, and it pretty much holds up to reality as well. So yeah, that's a fascinating take and requires you to think a little bit differently about how you approach software. But actually, Elm very much informed frameworks like React. I think have taken some great ideas from that. So this is a really good example of where reading around other ways of approaching problems can help improve the space where you happen to work. The React guys freely admit to taking inspiration from Elm in the development of that framework.
You can definitely see the MVE pattern just spreading out, like, as you say, React taking on board that, and even like some .NET stuff. Like Microsoft is starting to look at this MVE pattern as well with their stuff. Right, so we are probably running out of time. So shall we do dev tips?
Sounds good. Yeah. So I have a dev tip for you. This is one of my favorites, and this one is very simple. When you have an exception crop up, read the exception. And I can't tell you how many times I've sort of been sat there with somebody and they've hit start and the application's blown up, and the first thing that they've done is run the application up again. And there's one of two things that's going to happen there, right? Most of the time, they'll get exactly the same error coming up again. In a small percentage of cases, it will work. And they've just thrown away the opportunity to get the evidence of that nasty race condition that's hard to reproduce. They've thrown away gold. But also, if you've got bugs being reported, often you'll find in App Insights or whatever logging tool you happen to be used, you'll find the exception. Read the exception. It usually tells you what the problem is. And it's amazing to me how often we can just overlook because we're making a snap guess at what the actual problem is and end up wasting time going down a completely blind alley when the exception actually tells you what the problem was, where it occurred in the code, and even sometimes how to solve it if it's a very well-written library that's thrown that exception.
I remember you gave that dev tip at .NET Oxford quite a few years ago, and that's been so useful many times for me because one thing I tend to do, and I'm sure that lots of developers can relate to this, is if I see an error, but I've just been working on something that I think I know what it is, I might just subconsciously ignore the error and go back to my code and kind of like look at the code and try, it must be this, and try again. When, as you say, it's kind of, if I just stopped, looking at the error message would confirm that or tell me it's not what I thought it was. And like just slowing down. And quite a few times since you gave the dev tip a few years ago, because of that, I've stopped myself, and it's been really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it does very occasionally happen that the exception will have been caused by some state that has been created in some other process that happened at another time and has left things in a bad way, and you don't have all the evidence that you need. But actually, that is by far the minority of cases. Most of the time, you'll have all the information you need to solve the problem, and you just need to sort of methodically work through it.
Cool. So my dev tip is a command line tool called FZF, which I didn't actually know existed. Like, James is nodding, I can see in the webcam, so you've obviously heard of it. But I didn't know this existed until, there was an episode I did a couple of episodes back by Patrick Svensson, who was talking about his Spectre Console library. I think it was episode 14, where my dev tip at the end was the whole Control R history search in PowerShell and Bash. And in this tweet, and I'm going to ruin his surname here, but so I do apologise, Tommy, but his name's Tommy Lilhagen. So he's at Tommy Lil on Twitter. And he replied about this episode saying, "Really enjoyed this episode. By the way, regarding your conversation on using Control R to access command line history, have you tried FZF?" So I hadn't, But then I did, and this is pretty awesome. So basically, it's a command line fuzzy finder, and basically it lets you pipe text from other commands into it, and then you get put into an interactive mode where you can just type what you want to search for within that text, and it filters down the lines to match your fuzzy search. So if I did, for example, ls pipe fzf, then I can very quickly then type searches against that file listing. And when I hit enter, the output is that filtered result. And this kind of works with any text input like file listing, ls, process listing, git commands, whatever it is. One thing I find I do quite a lot now is I can do something like a command like ls pipe fzf pipe clip, which is another very useful command line tool. And if I do say ls, then it will interactively let me filter using this fuzzy search using fzf. Then when I press enter, it will dump that out to the clipboard. And I find that so useful in so many different use cases. And I don't know whether I'm explaining this very well because it's only audio only, but I can include a link to it in the show notes, which has tons of examples and a video. And based on your nodding, James, it sounds like you've heard of this. I can picture, knowing you, this would be something you would love.
Yeah, it's impressive actually how good a job it will do of indexing your file system. It's worth pointing out as well that it works on Windows and on Linux. So my tip for your tip is to install it twice, put it into Windows, but also put it into your WSL distro of choice, because it integrates really well with OMIZ Shell or Bash, tools like that, to give you a better Linux experience too. But yeah, it's really great for when those times when you can't quite remember exactly what the file was, but you can remember sort of what it was. So the fuzzy match aspect of it is dead handy. Yeah.
Yeah, as I say, I'll include a link to the show notes, and I think it's got lots of extensions. Things like there's a Vim extension, so it integrates very well with Vim if you're a Vim user. And with the more Linux-based shells, it's got like a team-up script, which would then put that into another panel, like the search results.
Yeah, there you go. You just got your know something different just right there. You can go and do that. Both file finding tools and perhaps even a bit of Linux if you've not got into that yet.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the whole command line thing, it's kind of, I know both you and I are big fans of the command line, but there's lots of developers that just don't touch the command line. And that again is a different paradigm. And I would never say that command lines are better than GUIs or GUIs are better than command lines, but you get different tools in both. And by excluding one, you're excluding some really good productivity tools that can help you out.
Yeah, well, I think increasingly now with the cloud as well, there's so many occasions when the command line is all you have. So, I did invest the time into learning Vim, and anybody that doesn't pretend that requires a significant investment is lying to you. There is a learning curve. It's pretty steep, but my God, it pays off when you can find, go into any sort of command line on an SSH into some pod in your Kubernetes cluster and be able to edit files without having a rich GUI tool to do so. I know there are other ways to work around that, but it's just so fast.
I guess that touches on, like before we started recording, we were chatting quite a bit about Git, which is probably too big a conversation to go into now, but that's another one which I know you're a big advocate of learning on the command line, maybe even before you touch a GUI. But again, you might find yourself in scenarios where you're shelling into something where the command line is all you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Know your command line. Yeah, that's a good tip as well. Yeah.
Nice. So before we wrap up, do you have anything else you'd like to mention?
Gosh, I don't think so. I think I'm probably talked out for today. I think we managed to get through a lot of stuff there. It's been a really good chat, Dan. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, that's okay. We've covered so much stuff. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been awesome having you on.
Thanks, Dan. And I will be listening with interest to your future podcasts. And it's really been a great selection of guests you've had to date. So all the best for the future.
Thank you. Well, I can't take the credit. It's just the amazing guests we've had on. I'm just lucky that the software development industry has got such an amazing community and people are just so keen to talk about technology.
So yeah, one thing I would say, of course, if anybody has got any great book recommendations out there that aren't on my list, then please connect to me on LinkedIn or send me a tweet, and I'll get them added to the book list.
We'll definitely do that. So, and thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we will, of course, include links to all the things we've mentioned today, which will be a long list in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.